The moment my body hit the ground, I knew something was terribly wrong. Not because of the impact, or the pain, or the taste of dust in my mouth. Those were familiar. It was the sky. It shimmered in colors no world should ever produce, bleeding purple into orange like a glitch trying to disguise itself as a sunrise. Buildings arched and twisted like metal trying to remember how to stand. The air felt warmer than it should have been, but the warmth didn't come from sunlight, it came from instability. A world trying to decide what version of itself it wanted to be. I pushed myself up, breath uneven, heart pounding, telling myself I'd landed somewhere survivable. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had been dropped into a world I recognized only in nightmares. A world that felt like mine, but broken beyond recognition. The moment I saw the skyscraper spiraling upward like a glass tornado frozen mid-twist, I understood the scale of the distortion. No physics, no timeline, should allow architecture to coil like living tissue. Cars floated sideways along its edges as though the world had forgotten what direction gravity belonged to. Every instinct in me screamed that I should turn around, run, hide, anything except stare. But this place wasn't following instinct. This place bent instinct into something untrustworthy. I felt like an ant crawling across the page of a book still being rewritten. A place where logic had lost its vote. And the worst part wasn't what I saw. It was the cold certainty building in my chest that this wasn't random. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone had reached into reality and folded it until the seams snapped. And now I was standing inside the damage. When the drones came into view, hovering like metallic ghosts scanning the air with temporal beams, I understood just how far from home I'd drifted. These weren't machines built in my timeline. They weren't built in any timeline I knew. They moved with a strange hesitation, as if deciding whether the present moment was worthy of existing. Their lights pulsed in patterns that felt suspiciously like language, like they were speaking to reality itself, asking permission to enforce whatever rules applied here. I held my breath, not daring to move, not daring to exist too loudly. I'd fought machines before, fought soldiers, anomalies, storms, but this was different. These things weren't looking for rebels or intruders. They were looking for mistakes. And in a world this unstable, I was certain I qualified as one. Hiding behind a warped bus frozen mid-explosion should have been impossible, but impossibility meant nothing here. The metal was curled like paper, suspended in time as though waiting for the moment reality would decide which direction the blast belonged to. I pressed myself against the cold surface, heart pounding against metal that shouldn't have existed in that shape. I told myself to breathe quietly, to move slowly, to think rationally, but rationality wasn't a currency this world accepted. The drones drifted past, their scans slicing through the air with an eerie hum. All I could think about was how small I felt. How fragile. In my world, hiding had rules. Predictable patterns. Here, even hiding carried risks I didn't understand. Because in a world out of order, sight didn't matter. Intent did. And for a terrifying moment, I wasn't sure I wanted to be found by a reality that wasn't sure of itself. The man walking down the street looked normal at first glance, until he moved. Each step carried him 3 meters ahead, as if the space between points simply didn't exist for him. His voice echoed in jagged pieces, scattered across seconds that didn't line up. It was like listening to a conversation out of order, fragments of sound fighting for sequence. I should have approached him, asked what happened, tried to understand this place through someone who lived in it, but he wasn't living. He was enduring. A citizen distorted by a timeline that no longer cared about continuity. His eyes darted around like he sensed everything collapsing but couldn't understand why. And watching him, seeing a person become a glitch, I understood the truth. This world wasn't dying from violence. It was dying from confusion. When I reached the intersection, my breath caught in my throat. I knew this place. The cracked pavement, the burnt-out sign, the faint outline of a path I once walked every day. It was all here, but mutated. Like a memory retold by someone who only half remembered the details. My first mission, my first anomaly, my first loss. This street had been the beginning of everything. But the version I saw now belonged to a different history entirely. The angles were wrong, the distances distorted. It felt like two timelines fighting over the same space. I knelt down, touching the ground, hoping to feel something familiar. But it was like touching a ghost, cold, insubstantial, hollow. This wasn't my past. It wasn't my future. It was a broken reflection of both. And somehow, I'd been pulled into the middle. Watching multiple versions of the same building flicker over each other was like witnessing reality breathe its last breath. Every few seconds, a new version appeared. Pristine, ruined, half rebuilt, futuristic, medieval, each one replacing the last with a jarring snap. The world was shuffling through its memories like a frightened animal looking for a safe form to hide in. And none of them held. Not for more than a heartbeat. I realized this wasn't decay. It was collision. Timelines overlapping without merging, competing for dominance in a world too exhausted to choose one. And in that flicker, those rapid, violent transitions, I understood the danger. If the world couldn't decide which reality it belonged to, eventually it would choose none. And everything, past, present, future, would collapse into a void with no version of existence left. The faint glow under my shirt made my stomach drop. The glyph, the one thing I thought I'd outrun, was back. Pulsing like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. I pressed my hand against it, feeling the warmth rise through my skin like a warning. It wasn't reacting to my fear. It was reacting to the world. The instability. The fractures. It recognized this place long before I did. Because part of me wasn't fully here. Part of me existed across the timelines still pulling at my seams. And the glyph, it was the anchor. The reminder that I hadn't escaped anything. I'd only been delayed. Whatever force had brought me to this twisted world hadn't done it by accident. The glyph returning meant one thing. I was still connected to the storm that created all of this. And it wasn't finished with me. The giant clock tower should have been a landmark of stability. An anchor point, a reference, something absolute. Instead, the hands jerked forward, then backward, then froze altogether in a position that defied logic. Time wasn't choosing direction anymore. Cause and effect had declared a truce and walked off the battlefield. Standing beneath that tower, I realized something terrifying. If time stopped choosing a direction, neither could anything inside it. Events couldn't follow from one another. Choices couldn't matter. Movement, thought, reason, they all depended on sequence. And this world had lost sequence. It was like standing inside the malfunctioning heartbeat of the universe. A place where moments tried to exist but couldn't decide when they belonged. And if this tower reflected the state of the world, then the world was dying in confusion. She appeared like a glitch in a corrupted file, one moment absent, the next fully formed, blinking at me with wide, terrified eyes. A teenage girl, maybe 16, her expression carrying a weight far older. Her edges flickered as if reality kept forgetting to render her properly. And then, with a voice sharper than fear itself, she said one word, run. No explanation, no warning, no context. Just a command. And something in her tone, something raw, something broken, told me I'd be a fool to ignore it. In every timeline I'd ever touched, danger announced itself with sound, with movement, with threat. But here, danger arrived in the voice of a child caught between realities. And if she was a glitch that knew more than I did. When the shockwave rolled down the street, it didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like a clock being shattered by a hammer the size of a planet. Everything the wave touched aged a century in a single heartbeat, then regressed into dust, then reassembled into something half-formed. Buildings morphed through decades like pages of a book flipping too fast to read. People froze mid-motion, caught in loops of 3-second panic. I felt the surge hit my skin like cold fire, racing across my nerves with a sharpness that rooted me in place. This wasn't an attack. It was a correction wave. Reality trying to fix itself by erasing the contradictions. And anything caught in the way, living or not, was rewritten without mercy. If Nova hadn't shouted, that wave would have rewritten me too. I followed her without thinking, my feet moving faster than my mind. The world behind us twisted like a living bruise, colors bleeding into each other, structures collapsing inward as though time itself had grown tired of maintaining the illusion. The girl moved like gravity didn't apply, her steps glitching between intervals, her body stuttering in half frames. I wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, who she was, what she knew, why she was glitching, but the answers could wait until we weren't about to be erased. Each breath clawed at my lungs as the ground trembled beneath us, shifting shape with every second. Whatever this place was, it wasn't stable. And the longer we stayed, the more I felt like we were running through a world that didn't want runners. It wanted conclusions. When we crossed the shimmering threshold into the bubble, the world snapped into clarity like someone wiping condensation off a mirror. Sound returned first, clean, consistent, unbroken. Then color, settling into tones that didn't flicker or fade. Gravity steadied beneath my feet, and the nausea that had been clawing at my stomach vanished. I didn't understand it at first. How could a place this stable exist inside a world tearing itself apart? And then I looked at her. The girl. Nova. She stood at the center of the bubble, her glitches smoothing out, her form sharpening as though this pocket of reality recognized her. Or feared losing her. Whatever force held this bubble together. It wasn't technology. It was someone. Her. And the moment I realized that, I understood just how dangerous she truly was. When she finally spoke her name, Nova, it felt less like an introduction and more like a confession. She said it quietly, cautiously, like the word itself might break the fragile stability around us. I watched her features shift ever so slightly with each breath. Tiny changes, subtle differences, as if two faces were fighting to occupy the same space. She didn't need to tell me what she was. The instability in her eyes, the tremor in her voice, the air warping gently around her. It all said enough. She wasn't just from another timeline. She was from two. A living paradox. A child split by fate and stitched back together by something that didn't care about consequences. And standing there with her, inside a bubble that shouldn't exist, I felt the weight of her existence pressing against mine. She wasn't human in the way the world understood. She was something entirely new. As I studied her face, its subtle flickers, its shifting edges, I realized the impossible truth. Nova wasn't just glitching because of the world. The world was glitching because of her. Two versions of the same child, merged into one being, carrying overlapping memories like tangled roots. Her presence created order and chaos in equal measure. She stabilized reality just by standing still, yet threatened it every time she breathed. She was a constant contradiction, an answer and a question layered on top of each other. Looking at her, I felt the uneasy weight of recognition. I'd seen anomalies, echoes, distortions, but never someone whose existence rewrote the rules by simply existing. And as frightening as she was, I couldn't deny it. The world needed her. And so did I. When Nova stepped closer, the bubble trembled around her like it feared her emotions might tear it apart. Her voice held the strain of someone carrying a truth far too heavy for any child. She told me the collapse wasn't random. That someone forced the merge. And the moment she said it, I felt a cold certainty settle deep in my bones. She didn't want to say the name. Didn't want to give her fear shape. But she did. And the world shivered. Seraph, 9. I'd fought him across timelines, survived his machines, outpaced his plans. Yet hearing his name here felt like a new kind of threat. If he could force worlds to collide, then the destruction I'd seen before was nothing compared to what was coming. When she whispered that Seraph 9 wasn't working alone, I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. The idea of a second threat, one powerful enough to stand beside him, was more than unsettling. It was horrifying. Because Seraph 9 wasn't just an enemy. He was evolution twisted into purpose. He didn't ally himself with anyone unless they were as unbound by limits as he was. Nova's eyes dropped, fear rippling across her glitching features, and for a moment, I wondered how much she'd seen. How much she knew. She was begging me to understand a truth she couldn't fully articulate. And the fear in her voice wasn't just for herself. It was for the world. All of them. Seraph 9 wasn't rewriting time. He was recruiting it. When I looked up and saw the massive rift splitting the sky, I felt the same kind of dread I'd felt standing in front of the Origin engine. Only worse. This tear wasn't a fracture, it was a wound. A gash carved straight through reality, bleeding strands of pure timeline energy into the city like lightning tethered to the ground. Each strand pulsed with memories, futures, entire histories collapsing into raw power. Seraph 9 was accelerating the merge, pulling every possible version of the world into a single catastrophic point. And watching that wounded sky, I understood the scope of his plan. Time wasn't just the battlefield. It was the weapon. When Nova collapsed, her body splitting into overlapping silhouettes, I lunged instinctively. Her skin flickered between two tones, her eyes glitching out of sync, her voice disintegrating into static. She clutched her head like she was trying to hold both versions of herself together. She whispered that Seraph was calling her paradox energy, calling the unstable force she embodied. She wasn't a survivor of the merge. She was a product of it. A battery. A power source Seraph 9 could use to stabilize the chaos he'd created. And in that moment, as she trembled in my hands, I realized she wasn't just running from him. She was trying to keep herself from being used as the spark that would finally push the world past the point of recovery. When I grabbed her hands, the light that burst from her nearly knocked me backward. It wasn't a glow, it was a fracture. A collision of timelines fighting inside her like two storms battling for the same sky. But as the light poured into my skin, something strange happened. She stabilized. Just enough to breathe. Just enough to exist. My glyph pulsed in response, syncing with her paradox like two impossible frequencies aligning. It hurt, burning through my nerves with a heat that felt alive, but it held her together. For a moment, we were two unstable beings propping each other up against the collapse. And I realized something terrifying. My connection to the engine wasn't just a curse. It was a bridge. A tool. And maybe the only thing keeping her from becoming the weapon Seraph wanted. When she pressed her forehead to mine, the world vanished. Replaced by a flash, sharp, blinding, unmistakable. Seraph 9 stood in the vision, towering beside a shadowy figure with 6 glowing eyes, their forms merging like two algorithms weaving into a single destructive code. I saw a world wrapped in tendrils of fractal energy, cities dissolving into patterns, humanity reduced to silhouettes frozen mid-fear. Nova's voice trembled as she whispered that he'd found another engine. Something older, something deeper, something no timeline was prepared to contain. There weren't supposed to be two. The first engine had nearly destroyed existence. A second one could end it. And as the vision faded, I understood why she'd come to me. Why this world had brought me here. I wasn't just fighting Seraph 9. I was fighting his successor. When the buildings started shifting, teleporting inches at a time like giant pieces of uncertain geometry, the air thickened with dread. Each structure groaned under the weight of competing realities, dissolving and reforming in erratic bursts. Nova held herself upright, barely, her voice trembling as she answered my question. Hours. Maybe less. That was all the time this world had before it folded in on itself. And watching the city stutter like a broken animation, I believed her. The countdown wasn't measured in seconds. It was measured in stability. In the thinning threads holding the timelines apart. And those threads were snapping faster than I could comprehend. If we didn't move, if we didn't act, this world would be swallowed by its own contradictions. When the black, faceless soldiers materialized, I recognized them instantly, even though I'd never seen them before. They moved like liquid shadows, limbs elongated, bodies bending in ways that defied bone and muscle. They weren't enemies. They weren't soldiers. They were immune responses, manifestations of a dying timeline trying to purge the paradox infecting it. And in their eyeless faces, I sensed a terrible truth. They weren't hunting us because we were dangerous. They were hunting us because we didn't belong. Even Nova, with all her paradox stability, shivered in fear. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't acting on orders. They were acting on instinct. And instinct in a collapsing world only had one directive: remove the anomaly. When the soldiers lunged, their movements blurred into streaks of black tearing through the air. I didn't think. I grabbed Nova and ran. The world behind us distorted with every strike, the asphalt rippling like water under their weight. They didn't step, they warped from point to point, chasing us with an aggression that felt inevitable. Nova shouted that she knew a place, but every fiber of my being doubted her. This world wasn't built on trust or logic. It was built on desperation. Still, I clung to the hope in her voice as we dodged collapsing debris and warped geometry. These creatures didn't want to fight. They wanted correction. And we were errors running out of places to hide. The alley stretched impossibly far, warping ahead like a corridor of broken mirrors. Each step we took echoed with distortions, the world behind us folding into itself with violent flashes of light. The ground dipped, rippled, reassembled. I wasn't running through a street. I was running through a world trying to erase its own mistakes. Nova's voice cut through the chaos, faint but determined, urging me forward. I didn't dare look back. I already knew what I'd see: shadow soldiers tearing reality apart to reach us. My lungs burned with the effort, but stopping wasn't an option. Not here. Not in a place where the moment you lost momentum could be the moment the world decided you didn't deserve to exist. When we reached the collapsed bridge, my mind went blank. The structure had folded into impossible angles, chunks of road hanging mid-air like disconnected thoughts. Gravity bent beneath it, pulling sideways 1 second, downward the next. I stared at the warped mess, realizing there was no path forward. No route. No logic. Nova, breathless and glitching, told me to jump. I almost laughed. Jumping into distorted gravity felt like accepting a coin toss where both sides meant death. But the soldiers were closing in, their distorted bodies flickering through the wreckage. Choice wasn't a luxury anymore. It was a demand. And so, with every ounce of reluctance in my bones, I leapt into the chaos. The moment my feet left the ground, gravity shifted violently, yanking us sideways onto a floating slab of asphalt suspended in mid-air. I stumbled, nearly slipping off the edge as the world beneath me twisted like a rotating puzzle. Nova landed beside me, surprisingly steady for someone flickering between two timelines. I couldn't stop myself. I asked her how she knew it would work. Her answer was as honest as it was infuriating. She didn't. That uncertainty hung between us like a second gravity, heavier than the distorted field around us. Every step from here on out would be a gamble, a desperate attempt to outrun a collapse we didn't understand. And somehow, that felt like the most familiar part of this entire nightmare. When the normal-looking house phased into existence on a ruined lot, my instincts screamed trap. It didn't belong here, its walls straight, its roof intact, its windows unbroken. In a world falling apart, nothing stayed untouched. Nova pulled me toward it, insisting it was safe. Safe. In any other context, I might have believed her. But here, safety felt like the biggest anomaly of all. The house hummed with subtle energy, like a heartbeat buried under the floorboards. It didn't glitch. It didn't flicker. It didn't change. And that was the most suspicious thing I'd seen all day. But with shadows closing in and the city fraying at the seams, suspicion had to wait. Survival came first. Stepping through the doorway felt like crossing dimensions. The interior wasn't a house. Not even close. It was a command center. Screens lined the walls, each displaying a different version of Earth, some recognizable, some nightmarish, some heartbreakingly peaceful. Machines pulsed with temporal energy, and the air hummed with a familiar frequency. I asked the question without meaning to. Who built this? Nova answered with a calmness that chilled me. I did. The words hit harder than any revelation before. Because if I built this place, it meant there was a version of me who survived long enough to prepare for this collapse. A version who saw this merge coming. a version who failed to stop it. And the thought of meeting him, meeting myself, was more terrifying than any enemy I'd ever faced. When the lights died, plunging the room into darkness, the hum of machinery deepened into a mechanical growl, low, resonant, ancient. Screens flickered, each displaying the same image, a silhouette stepping out of the shadows. Then the hologram ignited, projecting an older version of me. Scarred. Hardened. Eyes glowing with the same fractal light as the engine. He spoke with a voice that carried weight, years heavier than mine. He said if I was seeing this, the merge had already begun, and I was already too late. Hearing my own voice say those words felt like drowning in inevitability. Because suddenly, it wasn't just Seraph 9 I had to confront. It was the future I'd become. And that future wasn't here to save me. It was here to warn me. The signal fades, but the story never ends. Like, share, and subscribe. To keep the world of Epic Outlast alive.